All right, folks, we're out here in the shop today and we are gonna make up a new set of wood arrows. And we're gonna talk about a lot of different things today that revolve around wood arrows, like the difference in shafts, difference between wild and domestic feathers, FOC, broadheads, tail tapering, and a lot more, so stick around. So I've got a couple of really big trips lined up for this year, and so I'll need to make sure that I've got plenty of arrows that are all matched the same. Now, the arrows that I've got here already made up, these are Doug fir shafts. I got these from Sherwood. They're tail tapered 11/32, and they're tapered down to 5/16 on the back end. We're gonna talk about why I like to do that here in just a little bit. Now, the other thing that you'll notice is that I've got a pile of fletchings here. Now, these are all wild turkey fletchings that I just made yesterday. And I like to make, when I have time, I like to make my own fletchings from wild birds. And the reason I like to do that is, one, they look cool. They're just a beautiful barred, black and white barred, and they just look good on a traditional wooden arrow. The second reason I like wild feathers is, although the feathers that you can get from True Flight and the other Gateway is another big manufacturer of feathers, they make great products, but when it comes to durability, especially when they get wet, those domestic feathers just can't hold a candle to what a wild feather can withstand. These things are just much more durable, they last longer, they stand up better when they're wet. So if you have the time, or you can make your own fletchings from wild turkey feathers, there's a world of difference between these and a domestic bird. Now, I want to make mention that this video is not going to be a full-on how to make wood arrows video. We're just going to talk about a bunch of different things that kind of revolve around wood arrows. If you are looking for a video or a series of videos that is very in-depth on how to build very nice wood arrows, I'm going to direct you over to Andy Ponce's channel at Addictive Archery. I'm going to put a link to his channel down in the video description. But Andy makes some he's a professional arrow maker. He makes very nice arrows, and he's got probably the best series on wood arrow building on YouTube. And so go down there and click that and check his channel out. Now, the shafts that I've got here, these are, like I said, tail tapered Doug fir. These are from Sherwood shafts, and when I called them up, I had them send me some of their lighter weight shafts. These shafts are right around upper 300s to 400, maybe a little over 400 grains. I haven't weighed these in a while. I can't remember exactly what they are, but I've got some new ones on the way that weigh right around 410 grains. Now, the tail tapered part of it, I like tail tapered shafts, and I like shafts that are fairly small diameter. Like I said, these are 11/32, and they're tapered down to 5/16. Now, the tail taper does a couple of different things. One, it gives you a little bit more leeway in pushing your FOC up, or your balance point for your arrow. And if you're not sure what I'm talking about when I say FOC, that's front of center, how far front of center that balance point is. I've got another video that I'll link to. I'm going to put a card up here that explains what FOC is and why I pay attention to it. Some guys are kind of indifferent to it, but I personally put a lot of stock into it, and I pay a lot of attention to my FOC. And so by removing material from the back end of the shaft here, that's automatically going to push that balance point forward just a little bit. It's not going to do a lot, but it will give you a little bit of an edge. The other reason that I like tail tapered arrows is, and I don't have any data or anything to really back this up other than my own observations, but I just feel like with that tail being just a little bit smaller than the shaft diameter, I feel like that just gives you a little bit extra edge in getting a complete pass through, because anytime you can find your arrow after a shot, there's so much information that you can gain from that. And I always like to get a complete pass through so that I can go and grab my arrow and pick it up and look at it and inspect that thing to gain all the information that I can from it before I take up a trail. Now, I want to go back to FOC for just a minute because I get a lot of questions from guys about, they're asking about FOC and tuning their arrows. And I think some people might be a little bit confused because I did a video that talks all about FOC and the added benefits that you can get as far as penetration goes by bumping your FOC up. Now, I want to clarify something, that FOC comes second to perfect arrow flight. And so don't think that you need to shoot a heavy broadhead or anything else that's going to bump your FOC up if you have to compromise perfect arrow flight. You've got to have perfect arrow flight, and then once you have that accomplished, dad blame it. Once you have that accomplished, then you can start thinking about FOC. So one thing that you'll notice if you ever get a chance to look at my arrows up close is that I tend to fletch mine really far back. And one of the reasons that I do that is because the farther back you get your fletchings, the more effective they are, basically. And so you're using, you can think of this arrow shaft as a lever. And so the farther back you apply that, whatever pressure it is, and here it's air pressure on these feathers, the farther back you apply that, the more effective or the easier time it's going to have at correcting that arrow flight. And so I fletch mine basically all the way to the back of these Bitzenberger Fletchers. And what that does is when I put my fingers on the string, that fletching is, I mean, like 1/8 of an inch or so in front of my fingers. If you were shooting with like a heavy glove on or something like that, that's going to cause problems for you, so you might want to fletch it a little bit farther up. But I can't shoot with a heavy glove on anyway, so it's not a problem for me. The other thing that it allows me to do is, because those fletchings are farther back and are more capable of correcting that arrow's flight, it allows me to shoot a smaller fletching. If you'll notice, these fletchings are only 4 inches long and they're a little bit of a curve to it, kind of a parabolic or a shield, but then it's straight off on the back. And they're not very tall. They're probably at the tallest, they may be 5/8. Probably less than 5/8, but certainly not any less than 1/2 inch on the back. There's really not a lot of surface area there. It's a quieter fletching, and it doesn't introduce a lot of drag on the arrow, so it's not slowing those arrows down downrange like a big, 5 or 5.5 inch feather will slow it down. But I also spend a lot of time getting the tuning on my arrows just right. And so these arrows, I could strip the fletchings right off of them, and as long as my form and everything is dialed in, these arrows are going to fly perfect without any fletchings at all. I think it's very common in traditional archery for guys to kind of cover up tuning issues with big feathers, and that's fine, you can do that, but you're giving up a lot in terms of your trajectory and your speed when you do that, when you use those big feathers to cover up tuning issues. If you spend a little bit more time and got those arrows tuned right, you could really cut those fletchings down, and your arc or your trajectory is not going to be quite so pronounced. You're going to have a lot more speed downrange, and probably you're going to find that your arrows are a lot quieter as well. So the broadheads that I'm going to be using these are the 190 meatheads, and they're made by Toughhead. And I've been shooting Toughhead broadheads off and on for probably about 10 years. They're a great head, but I get a lot of questions from guys about broadheads, and they're concerned with blood trails because these are not a wide head. I'm not sure what the total width on these are, but they're not a very wide head. The reason I like these heads is because I feel like with a single bevel, cut on contact, fairly narrow head, especially one with that 3-to-1 length to width ratio, I feel like if I come in contact with heavy bone, like if I clip the edge of a shoulder blade or something like that, I've got much better chance of getting through that and getting into the vitals. You know, if you take this on one extreme and then you take like a real wide expandable or something like that on the other extreme, guys, I don't care if you're shooting the fastest compound bow in the world. If you shoot an elk in the shoulder blade with an expandable broadhead, you ain't getting through there. Now with something like this, you have a chance, and especially if you're shooting a compound with a single bevel cut on contact head, with the amount of energy that a compound puts into the arrow, especially if you're shooting like a 600 grain arrow, you could shoot that thing through a brick wall and it's not going to stop. And so I like the single bevel fairly narrow heads. Now I get questions from guys that are concerned about blood trails with these narrower heads like this, and in my experience, and I'm not saying this is fact, I'm just saying that this is in my experience, the blood trail that you get, really the type of broadhead that you shoot really doesn't have a lot to do with it. Now I know that there's going to be guys out there that are ranting and raving and screaming at their computers right now, or their phones, or whatever you're watching this on, but like I said, in my experience, shot placement, where you put that arrow, is going to be it's going to carry a lot more weight than the type of broadhead that you shoot. So with these arrows, I tried some different products that I've never used before. To seal these things, I used the Bonning's Blue Super Coat. It's a durable coating. I've always used gasket lacquer in the past because it's a very quick, fast drying sealer. I mean, you can basically dip that thing in a dip tube, and it's got the squeegee on there. Dip it, you can dip a dozen arrows, and by the time you're done with the 12th arrow, you can go back to the first one. I mean, it dries like that. The problem with gasket lacquer is if you are stump shooting, or kind of being kind of rough with your arrows, that gasket lacquer has a tendency to crack and kind of spider web. And so a coating like this is going to be much more durable if you're doing much 3D shooting or stump shooting or something like that. The problem that I found with this is that, and I don't have an arrow here, it's in my quiver in my on my bow in the house, but it has a tendency to what they call target burn. So if you're shooting a bunch of 3D targets, it'll actually, when the arrow strikes the target, it creates a little bit of friction, and I guess it melts that just a little, very thin bit of target material onto the arrow shaft. And if you shoot over and over and over again, that stuff just kind of builds up a little bit. But all of this stuff, I mean, this is good. It's a small little nitpicky thing, the target burn. Now, one other thing that I want to talk about is, so most of you guys are going to be using one fletching jig, or maybe a multi-fletcher like a Joe Jan or something like that to fletch your arrows. Most guys aren't going to have a setup like this where you have a dozen Bitzenbergers on a round table like this. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time and get lucky and got a smoking hot deal on all of these. But normally these things they cost like 90 bucks a piece, so most guys aren't going to be able to afford that unless you're a professional arrow maker. But if you do have multiple fletching jigs, it's important to have them all set up exactly the same. And it can be tricky to get them exactly the same. And so what I do is I fletch an arrow on one jig, and I go ahead and glue the fletching on there, let it dry, and then if I'm using Bitzenbergers like this, I loosen the bolts on the rest of the clamps, take the clamps off, put them on the arrow, then put them back in the jig, and then let the clamp adjust, or let the actual jig adjust to the clamp. Now once it's adjusted there, then you can tighten those bowls back up, and this clamp is going to be the same as the clamp that was used to actually fletch that arrow. So that's one easy way that you can use to make sure all your fletching jigs are the same. All right guys, that's all I can think of to talk about on this video. Like I said, I've got some big, really exciting trips coming up in 2020. So if you're not subscribed to the channel and following along on Instagram, be sure to do that, because I have got some pretty epic things coming this way. So with that, good luck. 3D season's coming up, so get dialed in for that, and we'll see you next time.